Hello and welcome everyone from wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us today. I'm James Rice, an affiliate of the Hayek program at LSE and the host of this lecture. This webinar today is part of an ongoing series by the LSE Hayek program, affiliated with the Economics Research Institute Steickerd at the London School of Economics. The aim of this online series is to explore a range of interdisciplinary topics that are related in some way to the intellectual contributions of economist F.A. Hayek. These include individualism and economic freedom, the nature and future of liberal democracy, social justice and welfare, decision-making under uncertainty, macroeconomic management, the rule of law and justice, and others. I encourage everyone to check out our future events, both virtual and in-person in London, on Eventbrite, which I will shortly link in the chat, where I will also link our past recordings of webinars that are posted on YouTube, also in the chat. We're pleased to have an exciting lecture today with a leading voice in technology policy, Adam Thierer, whose talk tonight is titled Defending Technological Dynamism and the Freedom to Innovate in the Age of AI. Adam Thierer is a senior fellow in the Technology and Innovation team at the R Street Institute, where he works to make the world safe for innovators and entrepreneurs by advancing a policy vision rooted in the idea of permissionless innovation. Prior to joining R Street, he spent 12 years as a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and before that served as president of the Progress and Freedom Foundation. Earlier in his career, he held positions at the Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation, and the Adam Smith Institute. He holds a master's degree in international business management and a bachelor's degree with a double major in political science and journalism. I hope I got all that right. Adam has authored or edited 10 books spanning online child safety, internet governance, intellectual property, telecommunications policy, media regulation, and federalism in high technology markets. He's perhaps best known for Permissionless Innovation, the continuing case for comprehensive technological freedom, which laid out the foundational case against precautionary principle reasoning in technology policy and helped frame much of the contemporary debate for how governments should respond to emerging technologies. His follow-up volume, Evasive Entrepreneurs and the Future of Governance, extended that argument by examining how innovators in fields ranging from ride-sharing to 3D printing to drones are reshaping the relationship between citizens and the state through what he calls technological civil disobedience. In 2008, he received the Family Online Safety Institute's Award for Outstanding Achievement. Adam will speak for approximately 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A lasting 15 to 20 minutes. You may drop your questions over the course of the presentation using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I will collect these questions and begin posing them to Adam at the end of his lecture. Please note that this webinar is recorded and will be uploaded on YouTube in the coming days. So if there's anything you missed, you can find all recordings to our previous lectures, including this one, on our YouTube page. And now, without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Adam to begin his lecture.
Well, thank you so much, James. It's a real honor to be here and talk to you and the audience tonight. I wanted to just very briefly mention before I start my presentation a bit about sort of my origin story, if you will, about how I got involved in the field of emerging technology policy. Because interestingly enough, it goes back to London in 1991 when one day after work at the Adam Smith Institute, I went to a bookstore not far from the London School of Economics and picked up an old copy of the Constitution of Liberty. Apparently it was £14.99. So 1991, I picked this up and immediately began consuming it. And on chapter 3, I knew my life was changed because I came to Hayek's famous chapter on the common sense of progress. And what you're going to hear tonight is a lot of reflections that basically build upon what Hayek taught us so long ago about the future, progress, technological innovation, economic growth, and so on. So without any more ado on that, I'll jump into my slide share here. I'm going to go ahead and pull those back up. And then, James, you can let me know if they're coming across okay. Hopefully can get the full screen. There we go. Everything
Yes,
look okay?
perfect. Perfect.
Okay,
Yep.
great. So again, my talk tonight is based upon my work about the battle over technological change, and the question that animates all of my work over the last 34 years in the field of emerging technology policy is this question here, which is what policy vision or policy default will govern our future and the future of technological innovation? Um, in my book on permissionless innovation, I begin with a quote from Hayek about what he said in the Constitution of Liberty about what matters is a successful striving for what at each moment seems attainable. It is not in the fruits of past success, but in living for the future in which human intelligence proves itself. I thought that was a perfect way to kick off my book, and I thought you'd just enjoy that since this is a Hayek lecture. In all of my work over the last 30 plus years, I kept coming back to the fact that there were sort of two competing visions at work about how to govern technology and technological change. One of which had a very clear label that we had affixed to it in other fields like environmental policy and others, and that was the precautionary principle. But the other pole didn't really have a good name. And I thought to myself, well, this phrase permissionless innovation, which I should note I did not coin, I did not come up with. Nobody knows who came up with it, interestingly enough. But I thought that was a good way of describing what might be the opposite of the precautionary principle. Now, what do we mean by these two visions or goals? Well, the precautionary principle, quite obviously, is about policies that would limit new innovations or technologies until it can be proven that somehow they won't cause any sort of disruption or harms to society. And so this is very much rooted in an idea of, better to be safe than sorry, and a preemptive regulatory or anticipatory approach to technology. Well, the opposite vision that I've labeled permissionless innovation refers to the idea of a general freedom to learn and experiment with new technologies, an openness to change and to creative destruction and risk-taking, and an avoidance of prior restraints on innovative or entrepreneurial activities, and a search for more bottom-up solutions to problems as opposed to top-down. So when you put it together, there's a very serious to borrow a phrase from another famous economist and social philosopher, Thomas Sowell. He used the term conflict of visions in one of my favorite books of all time. There's a real conflict of visions at work here about how we think about innovation and progress, whether it should be carefully guided by the state or more of a freewheeling bottom-up enterprise. The priority in the precautionary mindset is much more about stability, equilibrium, preservation of the status quo or certain types of institutions or values, whereas in the permissionless innovation mindset, it's much more open to the idea of spontaneous order and experimentation with new business arrangements and other things. And so this leads to a very different set of policy prescriptions when you think about how to actually go about regulating technological innovation. You have two very different policy playbooks that emerge from the precautionary principle versus permissionless innovation. Obviously, the precautionary toolkit relies on various types of prior restraints and product prohibitions, potentially even outright censorship of speech, licensing and permitting, and various other types of restrictive defaults and ongoing, pretty heavy-handed, top-down or hard law-oriented regulation of emerging tech. By contrast, permissionless innovation gives entrepreneurs a green light and basically says you are presumed to be innocent until proven guilty of something. You can go out and experiment and do new things. And when we need to find responses to risk, we try first to find ways to acclimate to new social and economic changes. We then consider other types of educational or empowerment-based approaches to help people advance to new options. We think about self-regulatory approaches or the utilization of property rights, contract law, common law, and other types of soft law kind of arrangements or efforts before we start to get to the idea of regulating in a precautionary sense. So putting it all together, we can think of it like this. Like, do we start with the green light of permissionless innovation there, of the bottom-up sort of ex post approaches and solutions? Or do we start with the red light when we're confronted with technological change and new technologies? Do we start with prohibitionary efforts, bans, very restrictive steps? Now, of course, I should admit that not all policies, not all technologies are treated at one of these other two extremes. It's usually somewhere in the middle for a lot of technologies. But where you start the discussion matters. And it's really, really important, as I'll argue here now, that we think about starting it in the green zone and not the red. Why? Because I think the fundamental problem with the precautionary principle, as I said in my book, is that if we spend all of our time living in constant fear of worst case scenarios and premising public policy upon such fears, then it means that a great many best case scenarios can never come about. As Hayek taught us, it really is only from experience, from the wisdom of living through progress and change that we learn and that we find ways to prosper, including by learning from our mistakes and failures. This is one of my favorite cartoons of all time from a cartoonist named Hardin. It's a picture of a bunch of bureaucrats sitting around in a room, and somebody says, "We've considered every potential risk except the risk of avoiding all risks." I love this because it reflects the timeless adage of Samuel Johnson's quote about once he said that there's nothing will ever be attempted if all possible objections must first be overcome. You have to be willing, in other words, to take some risks, to engage in an openness to the future if you want any sort of progress and prosperity. What are the specific types of problems when you have a precautionary principle sort of default? Well, obviously, it manifests itself in less market entry and various lost opportunities for market growth, and you potentially have the problem of cronyism and capture set in. It can affect economic growth overall over time. From the perspective of like speech, it can limit speech and knowledge sharing. And for consumers, it could result in less choices, higher prices, and just sort of less freedom across the board for both innovators and the public. Now, of course, there could be a case made for the precautionary principle. I mean, we clearly have the precautionary principle in effect in certain sectors and technologies. Nuclear power is a good one, aviation is another. Really, for the precautionary principle to make a lot of sense, it has to be in cases where the risk in question is highly probable, tangible, immediate, irreversible, catastrophic in character. But most cases in technology just aren't like that. Most generally are of a very different character and do not require us to begin with the red light of precaution. And so, generally speaking, my book and my work always comes down to this focus, which it's best to start on the green and not on the red, and then work our way over as necessary. But it's always better to start there with the vision of permissionless innovation. Now, let me turn to today's modern hottest debate, which is AI, ML, robotics, autonomous systems, and so on. This is the focus of almost all my work over the past 10 years. And I'll begin by just outlining why it's so complicated to go about thinking about governance regimes and regulation for AI. I'll start with the fact that, as many governments and others have said, we lack consensus definitions for a lot of things in the field of autonomous systems and AI, including the very term itself, which, as this US government report pointed out back in, this is long ago, it's 2018, but still true today. There is, quote, no single universally accepted definition of AI, but rather differing definitions and taxonomies. And of course, that's equally true not just for the term AI, but of course, when you get into the broader discussions about what is AGI, what is superintelligence, and so on and so forth, these are contested terms. But there's even more complexity when it comes to definitional challenges surrounding artificial intelligence. At least here in the United States, where I'm at, there's a huge debate going on, really among industry people and policymakers about what classifications within the world of AI to put everybody in. So there's these silos of like, are you a developer of AI, a deployer, a distributor, an integrator? And there's actually more. This leads to not only a lot of policy confusion, but a lot of infighting between industry as they try to compete and jockey for power with lawmakers to make sure that they sort of cover their own butts, but then throw the other guy under the bus, if you will. Problem number two for AI policy is that AI is probably the most general purpose technology of all time. Obviously, GPTs are technologies that affect every single segment of our society and economy. And in this sense, AI is spreading widely right now and holds the potential to touch everything at some point, which leads to an erosion of old sectoral boundaries in once distinct sectors and also old regulatory distinctions, as I'll get to in a moment. Problem number three is that AI and robotics are dual-use technologies and very important ones. These are, of course, technologies that have both many peaceful applications, but some important militaristic ones. And so this creates some real problems when you try to go about regulating AI on the grounds that will create some sort of existential risk or that it's going to be used for dangerous purposes by government. I mean, the opposite of that is that, of course, that will affect everything upstream and downstream as well if you try to regulate it like it's a munition of war or something. It will also have broad-based ramifications for geopolitical competitiveness and security. And then the fourth problem is the fact that we're facing just an incredibly rapidly evolving technological landscape and business marketplace when it comes to AI, robotics, and autonomous systems. It just seems like every single day of the week brings some breaking news on this front that upends everything that we had thought we had already settled just a few days prior. And that's because the so-called AI stack is very fluid and expanding fast, and that there's many different types of foundational building blocks to AI. And so you think about the layers of the AI stack, they're constantly evolving, and the players and names in these fields are not in some cases players and names that were even on the playing field a few years back. It's astonishing to me that how much time and attention we spend thinking about OpenAI and Anthropic, and just 4 years ago, those were two companies whose names were not on any of our lips, and yet here they are with some of the world-leading LLMs. And again, just on the point about building blocks and technological convergence, you have to think about all the different technologies and sectors and things that go into what we mean by AI and ML and robotics. I mean, there's just so many different types of building blocks. And so to regulate AI is to essentially regulate all technology to some extent. Now, I mentioned on a previous slide, I didn't go through it, but like one complicating factor here is that because of the pace of change, we have the so-called pacing problem creeping into this debate. The pacing problem is something that gets a lot of attention in the field of science and technology studies. It basically refers to the fact that quite obviously technological change happens very, very rapidly in technological sectors, sometimes almost exponentially, but not always, but very fast, right? But political systems, as we know, change very incrementally. And the gap between those two things is called the pacing problem. And this is something that a lot of policymakers and a lot of pundits wring their hands over, this ever quickening pace of change. Of course, one person's pacing problem could be another person's pacing benefit. This might be good news depending on where you sit. And in some ways, this really shakes up markets and it shakes up politics in some interesting ways. Just something to keep in mind, and I'll reference it more in a moment. Okay, so let's talk about how this all plays out and try to put together the theory that I introduced first and then the issues that I raised about artificial intelligence and talk about the political economy of AI policy. And I want to start by talking about two complicating factors, if you will, that aren't always discussed that help understand why we're having such an intense debate over AI today. I'll start with the fact that there are cultural elements in play here that aren't always appreciated. You've probably all heard the famous quote, politics is downstream of culture. Well, it's very much, it's incredibly powerfully and true in the field of artificial intelligence politics. When you think about it, the mindset of the citizenry out there when it comes to AI and robotics has been very much shaped by movie and television depictions of AI and robotics. It's hard for me to go to any debate at any college or in any congressional hearing room without hearing somebody reference Terminator, 2001, Black Mirror, some other type of movie or television plot. This just comes up again and again and again. And this is sort of like conditioned our brains a bit, if you will, to think in highly dystopian terms about the future and about specifically these technologies. And this has proven to be extraordinarily powerful, at least in America, but I think probably also in the UK. And then, of course, in the academic world, fear is a powerful seller of books, and it drives a lot of publishing in the field of science and technology studies. You won't find any bestsellers or books that are assigned on too many classroom lists that involve good news or take a positive approach to these things. Most of them are gloom and doom with, fairly incredible titles like the ones you see here from the most famous recent one being If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies, to things like Future Crimes and The Dangerous Master and, so on and so forth. Catastrophe. These are all too common, not just with books, but with academic papers, There was a very interesting paper or a journal article written recently about what it takes to get ahead in the field of science and technology studies. And it pointed out that if you do not write books and papers with titles like this that point to sort of pessimistic conclusions and advise precautionary prescriptions, you just don't get published. You just don't get attention. And that's a real problem. And this has shaped the AI policy dialogue across the world. There's another problem, which is a traditional political or public choice problem about the fact that there's just so many different forces aligned against technological change. This is a quote from a former United States Democratic representative by the name of Jim Cooper about Washington, but it's true of every capital. You know, in the past, he said, in general, is overrepresented in Washington. The future has no lobbyists. I've always loved that quote and used it in a lot of my work because it's very true. There just aren't nearly as many people lobbying for an openness to change as there are people who want to hold on to some preferred status quo. And so I tried to sit down one day and say, well, what are the leading forces that are aligned to basically stop the computational revolution? Who is it that wants to see AI very heavily regulated or the proverbial genie put back in the bottle entirely? Well, I tried to break it down to 10. It actually, the list went on to 18 in one of my papers. But if I bring it down to 10, I'd say it's these. I mean, obviously, you've had a number of people who are making claims about AI safety and risk of super intelligence and runaway AI leading to human extinction. That's one group, a very vociferous group of people. A lot of these folks in the UK in various programs, but here in America too. The second group is quite different. It's hard to put a label on it. I call them AI ethics advocates, but really it's people who believe that algorithmic systems are going to lead to a lot of systemic injustices or exacerbate existing ones. They believe it's going to lead to widespread discrimination or disparate impact and undermine various social justice goals. And there's a lot of legislation pending and now passing in the United States that goes under the banner of algorithmic discrimination and basically requires a lot of heavy-handed, like top-down audits and other types of investigations in new algorithmic systems before they're launched. More quickly, I'll go through some of these others. Obviously, with every technology debate, there's a concern about copyright and content and creative people. The content industries and creative artists come out usually in force against new technologies. That's absolutely been the case in this debate. Many of you may have heard of the major Hollywood strike that happened last year in America. One of the leading complaints of the Screen Actors Guild was the use of AI in movies. And so more of that's going to continue, a lot of bills being based upon that concern. The fourth driver is a massive one as well. Child safety concerns and issues also related to number 5 about it undermining the family or faith and humanity, human values, traditional institutions. This is a timeless concern as well. We've seen moral panics about, how previous media, whether it's video games, rap music, rock and roll, radio, broadcasting, movies, even books themselves would undermine the morals of youth or family structure or just distract us to death. The sixth is, of course, the classic concern about all automation. There are always going to be workers and in particular labor unions who believe that new types of innovation and automation are a threat to jobs and professions and therefore want to smash the machine, if you will. The seventh, of course, is the public choice problem of entrenched industry interests, especially licensed ones, who want to hold on to their professions or their jobs no matter what. If they see any threat at all, they want to see some sort of regulation imposed to limit new entry or new types of technological change. This is a chronic problem in every country, but this is driving a lot of law in America today in fields like healthcare, finance, transportation, and others. The eighth concern is sort of energy and environmental concerns about issues like data centers using too much energy or water, or will the use of AI undermine the environment in other ways? The ninth is the issue of like local control, or what the term we use in America is NIMBYism, not in my backyard. The concern being that AI is just taking over local communities or hurting local communities in various ways because of either the data centers or because of, it hurts our schools or whatever. It's sort of a combination. And then the 10th is just lawmakers and regulators themselves who feel like it challenges their power that it is a disintermediating force in society that needs to be dealt with in some fashion preemptively through precautionary controls. So that's my lay of the land in terms of where we sit with the politics of AI today. And I know this is very much a US-centric kind of position, but I think this is probably equally applicable in some ways to a lot of what's happening on the ground in the UK and other countries. So this all leads to the question, like, are we in the middle of a mass AI techno panic, and how far up the curve are we in terms of getting to the height of hysteria? As this one wonderful chart that was put together by my friends at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation many years ago to depict like how we often have with every technology a period where things get off to an interesting start, but then there's a bit of a panic that starts. And the question is, do you get to the height of the hysteria? And before you get there, do you see really crazy types of interventions and regulation happen? And we're like halfway there right now. We're moving our way up to the height of hysteria. The really interesting question is, do we come back down the curve? And do we get to a point of practicality as more people start to utilize algorithmic technologies and robotic systems and the like, and become more comfortable with it? I'm absolutely seeing this happen in the United States right now as more and more people visit cities where driverless cars are on the roads. We have 11 major US cities that have driverless car technology that has finally been allowed. And as soon as people take rides, it's like a game changer. It just opens their eyes to the wonderful potential benefits of driverless vehicles, which potentially could save so many lives. But really, the creepiness factor or the fear factor kind of goes away once you assimilate a new technology into your life. But people aren't really there yet for AI. It's still kind of very out there. It's not fully in their lives. And even when it is in their lives, they don't even know it, right? And so going back to the point I made earlier about sort of the cultural panic and how we've been conditioned to think in negative terms, that's still the operational norm, which is why I think we're moving more towards the height of hysteria, yet not coming down the other side of the curve when it comes to AI. So how does this manifest itself in terms of concrete proposals or policies? I mean, some of you have heard these ideas, right? I mean, we have heard people in Europe call for the idea of degrowth for a long time, and I've heard this new phrase being used by some European scholars of decomputing. And I just label it all a massive war on computation. Some of these things can be really extremes that are proposed by some of these people. I mean, we of course saw an effort a few years back to have a global pause on AI development, which it's not exactly clear how that ever would have worked, but it was pitched. Many of you may have remembered Eliezer Yudkowsky's call for destroying data centers by airstrikes in countries that do not comply with AI global bans or pauses, which is, an act of war to stop a technology, which is astonishing. There's been many calls for widespread technological surveillance of AI systems or AI development, including like direct monitoring of AI labs and researchers. Some have proposed the idea of nationalizing large compute, such that anything that was done in such labs had to be treated as a licensed or a completely government controlled thing. There was one proposal that came out of the UK a couple years back for creating a quote AI island where somehow all governments would work to put all the most high-powered compute in one place and then just allow certain people and I guess like lab coats and rubber gloves to go in and work on systems that treating it like basically a default biohazard of some sort. In more mundanely, but still important, there's now a whole lot of proposals having to do with concerns about automation and workers. The idea of robot taxes continues to have some saliency in a lot of circles here in the United States, and I've heard it overseas by other names, including the idea that basically any automation decision has to go through some sort of a new agency. And then if you do automate or utilize robotic technology or automation in some way, you pay a special tax into a special fund that would pay for workers that had their jobs taken by AI. Of course, that would be a direct tax on productivity. And it would undermine efforts by a lot of innovators to move in that direction. And then there have been finally a lot of calls, many calls for different types of new general purpose regulators for this general purpose technology, calls for things like a bureaucracy like a federal robotics agency or an AI control council, and even this mouthful, the National Algorithmic Technology Safety Administration. There's been many others. And then the final and most recent and important development, at least here in the United States, is there's a major movement afoot now to ban data centers for a certain number of years, some sort of moratorium on like how many can be built or where they can be built or if they can be built at all. We are very close to seeing our first state in the United States pass a 1 year ban. There are some states, including important ones like New York, that have proposed 3 year bans. And then most recently, there has been a federal law introduced by two lawmakers that would propose a federal moratorium on all data center build across the entirety of the United States. That's pretty astonishing stuff. That's essentially a different way to pause AI. So how robust or how active are these state lawmakers in the United States? And this is something that separates the U.S. from the U.K. is all of our provinces, our states, that is, that basically can go their own way on a lot of issues. And there are in the United States, as of this morning, 1,667 AI bills pending across the US. So my slide's out of date here because I just put it together a few days ago, and there's already been 17 new bills in just the past week. So this is an astonishing thing. We are seeing an explosion of regulatory activity across America that is unparalleled in my lifetime. In fact, not just for technology, but I would argue for any single policy issue. I have never seen this many bills introduced in 1 year in my lifetime for anything. And importantly, 270 of the bills are just being introduced by two states in America, California and New York. That matters because they have outsized influence on the national marketplace, as I'll note in just a second. But also there are a couple of other key states like Illinois and some others that have been very active, Massachusetts and others. And the reason it's important is because these are the most active regulatory states in the United States. These are states that really want to see the precautionary principle imposed and do it in a sort of patchwork basis from the bottom all the way to the rest of the nation, exporting it extraterritorially, if you will. So you have an interesting situation developing right now where you have the so-called Brussels effect of heavy-handed European Union regulation for emerging technology and AI in particular, starting to shape global standards or enforcement because of its extraterritorial reach. And a lot of companies who want to do business in Europe are expected to live under those standards. And then the question is, will that have applicability elsewhere? Many bureaucrats in Brussels believe it will, and they're very much proud of the fact that they have become, as they call it, the world's regulator. So the Brussels effect is a real thing. And then there's the California effect, which I just alluded to in my previous slide, which is the fact that we know that that one particular state, because of its outsized influence in the American economy, and the fact that it has so many existing technology innovators based there, has the ability to essentially set national standards for emerging technology that, ironically, align pretty closely to Brussels standards. Some of you may not know this, but the European Union even set up an office in San Francisco, California, to try to work with California officials to come up with consensus standards for how to preemptively regulate AI systems. Basically saying, the hell with whatever the US Congress wants. We're going to kind of do it ourselves unilaterally. And so both of these effects, the California effect and the Brussels effect, are very much rooted in precautionary principle-based thinking. And so the combination of them could lead to the equivalent of a sort of regulatory race to the bottom or lowest common denominator regulatory standards of saying whatever the most onerous rules are become the new global baseline for AI and robotics. So what's really weird about all this is that in many ways, artificial intelligence is already quite heavily regulated, both in the United States and in other countries, but it's not done in a specific way. We don't go right after AI. We have a lot of horizontal or general law that is very much applicable to AI systems. And we also have existing sectoral policies for very specific types of applications where AI would be regulated. The way to look at it is like this. You have horizontal or broad-based AI regulations like consumer protection laws, unfair and deceptive practices, defective product recall authority, civil rights laws, product liability, common law, competition and antitrust. All of these things are perfectly applicable to algorithmic systems, and many Democratic lawmakers in the United States, including the former Biden administration and many Democratic state attorneys general, have all made this point, which is that there's no get out of jail free card, if you will, for using an algorithm. You're still covered under existing laws. They're absolutely right. This is true. And moreover, there are all these vertical silos down at the bottom. Now, of course, these are US agencies. I apologize for that. I didn't have a time to map this on to UK agencies, but it's true in the UK as well that you have sectoral specific regulators that are starting to come to regulate autonomous and robotic and machine learning based systems in their own fields. Health regulators, financial and insurance regulators, transportation regulators, they are all looking at the implications of the AI revolution and figuring out how do our existing laws apply, for better or for worse. Some of these things can be very, restrictive and repressive and precautionary in character, but the bottom line is these policies exist. These rules are out there. AI is not developing in a complete, state of anarchy or a wild west, as we say in America. It is developing in a landscape that is driven by a lot of different laws and regulations. But what is being proposed is to add to this picture a whole new block of horizontal, broad-based, AI-specific regulations and bureaucracies, various specific types of general purpose AI licensing schemes, new types of broad-based liability imposed by the courts, new regulatory bureaucracies, and various types of mandates, AI audits, and algorithmic transparency requirements, or explainability, as it's called, potentially new types of speech or data controls. This is what's being proposed to add to the mix of all the other existing regulatory layers. And the thing about those new, proposals is obviously they're all very precautionary in character. These efforts are basically to say, let's take what we already have on the books, much of which is very precautionary, and add to it a whole nother layer of technocratic regulation that is very broad-based in general purpose and character. And I think that's a real mistake. I'm concerned about this, and it's a lot of what I end up fighting. So just to wrap up, so we can move to questions here, let me just go full circle and say, what is it that we might lose if that we indeed do adopt this sort of a proposal, these set of proposals, these sorts of regulatory systems for AI, and the precautionary principle prevails over a permissionless innovation vision? Well, I think it comes down to these four things. Obviously, first and foremost, the lost growth and opportunity that goes along with restricting innovation. It also undermines geopolitical objectives for nations and our security. I mean, we just can't forget that we are in a race with China and other nations that also want to have this technological capacity and capabilities. And I would rather have democratic nations like the UK and the US and other allies lead on this front, because it has really weighty ramifications for geopolitics. Third, obviously, these restrictions are going to undermine the knowledge revolution. We're talking about the greatest, learning, communication, and speech tool of our lifetimes. It's the next great information revolution. And we're talking about restricting it in some very onerous ways. And then finally, and most importantly, what it means for each and every citizen is a potential diminishment of health and well-being, and even also safety gains. People talk about their concerns about AI and safety, but the reality is that autonomous system robotics and AI could lead to public health revolutions across the board, both through direct health interventions, but also things like transportation improvements and many, many other types of things, improving job quality and safety and more. So this is what we would lose. This is the opportunity cost of foreclosing technological progress. So to end it, I'll go back to Hayek, because this is where it all started for me. The greatest loss of precautionary principle-based thinking is less freedom and progress by undermining what I, again, argue is the most important knowledge revolution in human history. And in that famous chapter that got me started on all this all those years ago on the common sense of progress, Hayek really said it best when he said, progress is movement for movement's sake, for it is in the process of learning and in the effects of having learned something new that man enjoys the gift of his intelligence. Civilization is progress, and progress is civilization. That concludes my presentation. I have obviously my book on this. I have a shorter paper that I published last year with the same title as this presentation tonight, on defending technological dynamism and the freedom to innovate in the age of AI, that I published through the Civitas Institute last year. And then just recently on Substack, to coincide with the 10th anniversary of the publication of my permissionless innovation book, I did a little short primer, sort of 10 questions on the 10th anniversary of permissionless innovation. So I welcome all of you taking a look at that. But now I will stop my presentation and open it back up, turn back to James to see if we might have any questions. Thank you.
Great, amazing. Thank you so much, Adam. That was an incredible presentation. It brought up a lot of questions for me, and I'm sure that our audience also has a good number of questions, and feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and I will begin to pose them in just one moment. But I wanted to pose a question or two of my own before we get to the audience, just so everyone has time to sort of formulate their own thoughts on the presentation. And what I really wanted to ask, I sort of wanted to ask two separate things. And one is oriented around these sort of technical details of like the types of work that AI can do and the types of work that AI is intended to do or was invented to do. And the other is sort of a more speculative policy question, and we answer these each in turn, Adam. So the first thing is really, what differentiates AI from previous technologies is that it's in the name. It's an intelligent technology. So it fundamentally affects the knowledge economy, intellectual life of human beings, and the ways that we think about and create new ideas. So I wanted to ask about that, and I wanted to ask, like, in essence, what changes now that we have a technology that is fundamentally geared towards the creation of new knowledge? So that's something you emphasized in the last half of your presentation is that, this kind of technology, it doesn't augment our human strength or, our ability to build buildings. It fundamentally augments, although it does augment some of those things with robotics, of course. But fundamentally, it augments our ability to think and our ability to generate innovations itself and our ability to create scientific knowledge. So I wonder what does that change about the policy towards AI that was different from policies that is different from policies towards previous innovations?
Well, it's a great question, James, and the way you framed it, you kind of helped me even answer it because you pointed out many times there that the importance of a knowledge revolution is something we should not take for granted. When we're talking about expanding the stock of information and knowledge available to humanity, we should not take that lightly. We should embrace that as an incredible opportunity for humanity to improve our lot in life and improve our health, our safety, our livelihoods, our enjoyment, our utility. And so I think the question is like, can people understand that and acclimate to it, or do they fear it and the potential disruptive effect associated with this knowledge revolution? I think one of the interesting things that's playing out in the United States is that, the artificial intelligence revolution comes on the heels of the internet revolution more generally and was built upon it. And of course, all that entailed in terms of like the explosion of knowledge in sort of Web 1.0 world, if you will, and then social media and everything else and smartphone revolution. But there's been a lot of qualms about that. There's been a lot of people who say, well, that hasn't all been, sunshine and roses. And they're right. There have been incredibly disruptive things for our society, for our jobs, for our nations, our economies, our families associated with the internet, social media, smartphone. Each knowledge revolution really changes humanity in profound ways. I happen to be a big believer that we bounce back, that we are a resilient species, and that we learn to use our tools to improve our lot in life, even though there is a real struggle in the interim. But we muddle through. I use the term muddle through a lot in my work. It comes from a 1959 article called "The Science of Muddling Through." That I particularly am enamored with. And I love that phrase because again and again, through every technological revolution, especially modern information revolutions, humans have found a way to muddle through. Not pretty, not it's not always comfortable, and there are serious disruptive effects, but we usually come out better for all of them. And a lot of people look at the modern information revolution of the internet and then now think about the one of AI, and they just kind of forget about where we've come from. I mean, I'm an old man. I'm 57 years old. I was born before humans first set foot on the moon. And back in those days, I grew up in the middle of a cornfield in the Midwestern part of America where we only had one really crummy television station that we could get in on our broadcast rapid ear antennas. We did not have a local newspaper. Our local bookstore was actually a pharmacy that sold some books. I could go on. We didn't have cable television, satellite. We didn't have satellite radio. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have any of that stuff. And we were living in a world of information scarcity, or as some scholars used to call it, information poverty. We were starved for informational inputs. The single biggest game changer in my entire life was when one day a traveling salesman came to our door in our small community and knocked on it and said, "Would you like to buy a set of encyclopedias?" And thank God my mom and dad said yes. It changed my entire life. Here was what I thought at the time was the world's information at my fingertips. Of course, in 1977, that was about the best you could do. We've come a long way since then, baby. I mean, that's incredible. We live in a world of information abundance now. And a lot of people like to complain about that and say, oh, information overload. What am I going to do? I can't take it. And it's overwhelming us and our families. Well, I'm here to say that a world of information abundance is better than a world of information poverty. And we have benefited in so many profound ways from the access to all of that information that we just have come to take them for granted. And now in the world of algorithmic science, machine learning, we're going to have even more. And the chances for moving out the technological frontiers on numerous fronts are profound, especially in the ones that matter most, like health, right? And public safety. I could go on all night long about just like my anger about how much regulators have held up public safety gains by limiting driverless car availability in the United States. While every single day in the United States, 100 people are dying because of accidents that are 94% of which are attributable to human error behind the wheel. The tally is almost 40,000 deaths in the United States alone. And of course, globally, this is a chronic problem. Driverless cars have already shown themselves to be vastly safer than human-driven vehicles. And yet, at every juncture, the precautionary principle mindset creeps in and is disallowed the type of change we need to allow more of these vehicles to be on the roads. And yet, where they are allowed in those 11 cities I mentioned, about to be 11, it's really just 10 right now. Everything is bad. It's like, it's incredible. You get into these vehicles and it's like, it's almost a boring experience. It's so safe. It's like, can't we go any faster? So they never get in serious accidents unless another human hits them. So you have to think about extrapolating from that what that means for the entirety of the algorithmic and robotic revolution across many different sectors, but especially, again, public health. I have, by the way, an entire series that I call AI and Public Health, that I come out with installments of how it's helping in so many medical and health-related sciences and fields right now to help diagnose, serious diseases, track serious ailments, address chronic problems, or just create a world of more personalized medicine. Not every doctor can spend all day with us, but an AI system can help you in ways that have been unthinkable in the past. So, as you can tell, I'm incredibly excited about this. I wish more people were.
Okay, great. So I have more questions, but I'm going to hold them off because we have questions coming in from the audience. And actually, the first question is actually quite close to my own research, which is on misinformation. But an anonymous attendee asks, what is your view on possible policy solutions on strengthening information integrity to minimize the risks and harms caused by disinformation in this type of discourse? How do we best regulate or prevent fake news and content, for example, on climate change?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are legitimate concerns in every technology and information technology revolution in particular about misuse of certain new tools. And in this context, misinformation can be a serious problem. I want to make two quick points about that, though. First of all, misinformation has always been with us in some ways, and questions about how you go about addressing it or controlling it are really important. Obviously, the question is what counts as misinformation or truth? That's always been hard. It's a profoundly metaphysical, sensitive philosophical topic, if you will. Like, what is this thing called truth? Goes back to pre-Greek times, right? I mean, so we're going to debate that forever. But I agree it can still be a problem. And there's another question about, like, will AI supercharge misinformation? I just want to say, and secondly, on this point, however, though, that regardless of how hard it is to define it, there are new and other ways to identify it and address it. And so a lot of the defense of freedom of speech comes down to a counter speech argument, which is that like, well, we have other ways to speak back or to counter it or to identify. And I still believe that. I believe it very much. I want to point out, I'm actually just finishing up a new book called The Future of Free Speech, that actually has some really wonderful discussion in here about efforts globally to address misinformation. And the authors point out that a lot of times it's backfiring with government efforts that actually create as many problems as they attempt to solve. And other times it ends up with bullying tactics or efforts by some authorities to try to identify misinformation in ways that benefit them but hurts their opponents. So we have to be careful with that. I want to say though that like in the last elections in America, there was a fever pitch concern about misinformation in the last election leading up to the election. And there were a lot of bills proposed to try to have, truth commission kind of things or like greater election oversight of the use of AI in the election. And there were some instances of where like people were kind of misusing it at the margin. But the reality is after during the election and then after, everybody was like, well, that was kind of a big nothing burger. Nothing really came of that. It wasn't a big as deal as people concerned about preemptively regulating it thought it was going to be. And we had an experiment, and it turned out all right. It doesn't mean to say there are no problems. But the thing is that when, this is what we do as humans with technology. When technology creates a new problem, we find new technologies that solve that problem. You rinse, wash, and repeat. We go through this process again and again. And I think we're doing this with misinformation. I think whether it's, your views on climate or your views on anything else, you can find plenty of informational sources out there that support it and, can check, authorities who are claiming one thing or another. I mean, during COVID, we had a real world test about like what was misinformation about vaccines and about public health. Got incredibly contentious. But at the end of the day, I don't think I would have wanted one single truth commission, as some people were floating at the time, to be the final arbiter of all of these things. I want a continued robust public debate, and maybe AI systems can provide some assistance in that in checking these things. Um, at least that's my belief.
No, I think that's a super interesting perspective, and it actually aligns a lot with the research that I do in my PhD. But so we're going to shift gears a bit, and we have a question about labor market effects of artificial intelligence. So we have a question that comes in, and it asks what whether there will be mass layoffs due to AI, and what will be the future of skill-based employment in the context of a technological revolution where we have, like we mentioned before, robotics and intellectual automation that can actually that can either learn skills or take over skills that only humans were able to do in the past.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a perpetual one that comes up in every single technological, wave of change. And look, we need to begin by admitting that absolutely technology and like AI is going to disrupt jobs and professions. It's going to change them. But there's something important to keep in mind with all of these discussions, and I think where I'll be heading with this, which is that like technology giveth, and technology taketh, technology giveth. It gives us new jobs, new opportunities, but we don't know what they're going to be. And it's that uncertainty associated with the transitional phase and like what's next that really weighs on people. And it always has. There's always been this concern. When I was writing my permissionless innovation book, as well as a new study on AI and labor market disruption, I went back through government reports in the United States, going all the way back to the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and the 80s. Almost every decade, there's been a major government report about the jobs of the future and attempts to sort of predict like, well, where do we need to steer people's attention or skills or, retraining or whatever it might be. And in almost every case, we got it wrong because we couldn't predict the future. In fact, we don't even have a vocabulary to describe the jobs of the future. When I was writing the permissionless innovation book, what I did is I laid out those government reports and all the job descriptions of things they thought were going to be coming along actual job board listings from that year, from modern times rather. And I basically tried to match them up, and there was no commonality because the terms or the names of the jobs that people were doing today would have been nonsensical to people in the 50s and 60s. For example, search engine optimization officer. If you would have asked a person in 1960s London, what the hell is a search engine optimization officer? They said, I don't know. Is it a public detective? They would have not known what that was. Likewise, there are people who are now basically getting really good at AI prompting. There's like a huge career in AI prompting and creating new types of art and other things through AI. What the heck would that have even meant 10 years ago? Right? Were we steering anybody in that direction 10 years ago? So this is the thing about the AI and jobs debate. It's the uncertainty that weighs on us, but I get it. The question is, what do you want to do about it? Do you want to freeze everything in place, like the jobs of right now, and that's it? Are we going to say that like a driverless truck can never roll down the road because it would take the job of a truck driver? There's no hope. I mean, we actually have a truck driver shortage in the United States right now, but the reality is that we don't want to be in a position where we would block such an important life enriching, life saving change just based upon freezing one particular job in place. It would be better to provide that person with benefits and transitional assistance to find new employment or just basically make sure that they're taken care of until they get back on their feet than it would be to completely foreclose progress in all sorts of important ways. So that is not always a satisfying answer to some people. And I will tell you this, James, I've even at times been willing to compromise in a pretty big way and say, I'm willing, for example, with Teamsters, that is truck union truckers in America, to say, we're going to actually give you your job for the next 5 years with the guaranteed income of being in a truck. But you don't drive anymore. You sit in the passenger seat and it's a driverless truck now, and you're just handling logistic duties and other things, and we're paying you. And it'll be guaranteed. I would rather see innovation continue to move forward, even if it means we're paying someone to sit in a passenger seat. And then maybe hopefully they find some new employment, new skill while they're doing it. Another final part of the puzzle will be like other types of general purpose retraining of workers. This is notoriously difficult for the reasons I've already identified, knowing what skills to train people on. We've been through this with trade adjustment. There was a healthy debate I was a part of in the early 1990s when NAFTA and GATT were being formulated in the WTO, and we had side accords that dealt with worker retraining. But a lot of those things didn't work out that well because, again, we weren't retraining them for the right jobs. We didn't know what the jobs were going to be. But the people found the jobs anyway. And they have all new sorts of sectors were created that we just couldn't have ever anticipated, including in sectors where we knew disruption was coming. The most famous story, of course, is automated teller machines and bankers. When everybody thought in the early 80s, this will completely put everybody in banks out of work because we've got machines handing out money instead of bank tellers. And indeed, bank tellers no longer hand you paper or coins at a bank. It's not what they do. But we have more people working in the financial sector than ever before. And of course, finally, you have the example that has become very famous of radiologists, which people were predicting 10 years ago AI would completely wipe out all radiology jobs because AI can read radiology reports better than humans. We have more radiologists than ever before today. They're just doing slightly different things, and AI is supplementing their jobs. It's what some scholars at Harvard University Business School call complex machine-human interactions. And that's the nature of the game. What's happening is we're learning by doing, learning in real time. It's a Hayekian spontaneous order kind of thing where we start to feel a new technology out and say, I can work with this. This is going to change my life and job, but wait a minute, I can do something different now. And as Milton Friedman taught us, human needs and wants are infinite. If you allow people to explore new ideas and new opportunities, new jobs are created that we couldn't have previously envisioned. So that's the magic of the future. At least this is the lecture I'm giving to my children who are 24 and 21 respectively and wondering about their jobs in the age of AI.
Okay. Wow. That was very interesting. That was your perspective is clarifying for a lot of us, I think. So we have another question from an anonymous attendee. They ask, so you've discussed in your presentation it was a lot about policy and regulation, but since this is the London School of Economics and this is the Hayek program, how could economics be used in designing policies for AI?
Great question. And I think there's many examples. I'll just give a few. I mean, first of all, there's a healthy debate right now about the question of algorithms and pricing. And a lot of people are concerned that if you utilize algorithms and machine learning to set prices, it will lead to all sorts of unintended consequences and so-called, again, algorithmic discrimination or bias will creep into it. In reality, as economists know, there are many beneficial forms of discrimination. Discrimination isn't always a dirty word. Price discrimination is a very important part of a free market economic system. And I'm a big believer that algorithmic technologies and machine learning can actually help us devise far superior types of product offerings and services and more perfectly tailor products and services for the masses. But we have to allow for it. We can't run in fear. And I think economists can show how beneficial it can be to allow that to run its course. It's not to say that if we find real world discrimination, we shouldn't, weed it out. If, for example, this is the big obsession right now in the United States. I don't know if this is as big as debate in the UK or not, but there are a lot of laws that are passing saying you cannot use an algorithm to help you set the rent for basic your local housing projects or something. And the concern is that like, well, it will allow land household owners, renters to conspire cartelistically, and that they will basically just all raise prices together. Well, we already have antitrust laws that police that, right? I mean, this is like antitrust 101. We can just address price fixing if we find it. So in one sense, it's like, what's the big deal? But like, what about the other story, the flip side? I mean, right now we have a serious housing crisis in many, many countries, including UK and America, that maybe we should throw some algorithms at and see what we can do a little bit better than our current policies are, right? Maybe we can create new, better product offerings, new opportunities, new housing opportunities for people. And that's an example where we can bring some economics to bear on the question. I could provide some other examples. I mean, in the field of healthcare, I mean, there's endless examples, because governments are always trying to regulate and control healthcare processes, prices, systems, and everything. There's so many ways in which we could show through economic science that like the trade-offs there have been so profound for patients, for citizens in terms of their health, by being denied basic types of services or of more personalized services. And you can actually model some of that. You can actually, walk through exactly what the benefits might be in terms of greater availability of certain types of services, shorter waits, just a better knowledge of oneself and one's body and the profound benefits associated with that and how it can bring down the overall cost of healthcare in a nation. I recently wrote a paper at the R Street Institute with a colleague where we talked about this and talked about these macro benefits as well as micro benefits associated with more personalized health, first and foremost for citizens, but then for the nation as a whole as they think about how to constrain bloated healthcare budgets and costs.
Great. So we're going to switch gears again because there's a different question coming in. Another one from an anonymous attendee. They ask, what should be the meaningful capacity building efforts for policymakers so that they can be better equipped to consider frontier technology risks and opportunities in any policy decision-making process? And I imagine this is sort of more of an international scope for this question.
Well, no, it's applicable here in the US as well, and in every country. It's really a question of so-called state capacity and state capability, if you will, to address problems in the information age and then now in the AI age. And one of the hopes of the internet that didn't really come fully to pass is that governments would have more fully embraced the use of various types of internet and online technologies to improve public services and make them more efficient. They did in some ways at the margins. I mean, finally, our driver systems in the United States, or DMVs as we call them, are getting better, and other things like automated, our process of getting various paperwork through and stuff. But it's still hard, too hard. I want to believe that government and government agencies can get better in the age of AI and embrace these tools. There were efforts under the previous Biden administration in the United States and now the Trump administration to try to find ways to get buy-in from various regulators and from agencies to how to improve processes and systems. But at the end of the day, all roads really do come back to the question of training and retaining talented people within governments that really can wrap their heads around these issues and stick around for a while. And this is probably a strange thing that you don't usually hear coming from a free market junkie like myself, but like this probably comes down to paying some government workers a lot more money and making sure that we can retain talent for longer periods, especially people who really understand these systems and how to integrate them into large bureaucracies and use them in a fair and equitable fashion. I think this is a big problem, especially in the United States. We just move very, very slowly on this, but I'm sure it's a problem in the UK as well. And it requires an embrace of these technologies, albeit with some safeguards. When governments utilize new technologies, we have to take special precautions because governments have more power over us and have more data about us. And of course, context matters. You need to have a risk-sensitive kind of approach to this if you're talking about using this for policing versus something more mundane, right? And so that adds some sensitivity and complexity to the questions.
Okay, so we have a group of questions discussing the BRICS countries and the global south. One of them is sort of generally about any policies that BRICS countries are implementing in the context of AI. And the other is suggesting it's sort of asking how global South actors should take part in shaping the policy dialogue and narrative, even when that policy dialogue is predominantly focused on the global North countries, particularly the US and Europe and also China, of course. But yeah, so I wonder your thoughts on these questions.
Those are great questions, and I've written a little bit about this in the context of the sort of the geopolitical tension between like the United States and China, who are racing to try to like attract more investment across the globe and try to find ways to work with various countries outside of, traditional democratic allies, looking to the global South and others. And this is an important question because China right now is actively involved through its Belt and Road Initiative and Digital Silk Road Initiative to try to like build out digital infrastructure across the globe and to attract, new support for their ideas, their worldview, and so on and so forth. And that's really deeply concerning to me because it comes at a time when America is becoming more isolationist and retreating from the world and becoming less global. Globalism is a dirty word in the United States these days, and that's a huge change over the last 30 years for me. And it's really unfortunate because I would like to see more engagement with the global South and with more partners across the globe, more openness on their part as well to these new technologies for the ways they can create new opportunities for investment and for employment and innovation. The biggest problem for the global South and for much of the rest of the world is that in all too often their domestic policies are so restrictive towards new forms of innovation that their best and brightest leave and flock elsewhere to innovate. We live in a world of global innovation arbitrage. People, investors, and companies will move to wherever they are treated most hospitably. And that's particularly true in information sectors, where it's easier to do this kind of thing, especially in an age of remote work. And so the best thing that those countries can do is to be open to new investment and trade and everything else, but more importantly, at the same time, change their own policies domestically to make sure that they are conducive to people who are the homegrown talent, the brilliant people there, staying there, investing there, building there, right? That's the central role. It can't just be the rest of the world like showering the global South with money or compute. That's not going to do it on its own. Those countries have to make a commitment to technological change and freedom.
All right, so that's all the questions we have from the audience. I'm going to pose one final question that's my own that I hope will maybe summarize some of your views on these subjects. So we've talked a lot about the regulations that need to be in place, the kinds of politics that are governing the ways that AI is being deployed and developed. But I wonder if you had the best possible world, the best possible scenario for the development of AI, what would that look like, first of all, politically? And what would that look like, second of all, in a sociological sense, where like, what would society look like once we've accepted, AI superintelligence or AGI? It's very speculative, I realize, but maybe you could give us your thoughts.
No, that's a wonderful question to wrap up on, James, and thank you for it. I love this question because I spent a lot of time writing about exactly this point about what it takes both politically and culturally to have a culture of innovation. This is something that Hayek wrote a lot about, that Joel Mokyr has written about, Deirdre McCloskey. I could go through all my heroes who talk about the importance of not just institutions, but attitudes towards innovations from policymakers and the public. And if you want a positive innovation culture that allows innovation and technological change to flourish and take root, you have to create that sort of an ecosystem. In fact, in Hayek's work and in Joel Mokyr's work and in many others, they often talk about innovation like a garden or like a plant that needs to be nurtured and fostered. And you have to have the right conditions in the soil and in the air around it if you expect anything to grow, right? And so to answer your question concretely, what does it mean policy wise? Well, it means, first of all, a more bipartisan embrace of the benefits of technological change. And here in the United States, we very much had this in the mid 90s when I began working in the United States after I came back from London. And the Clinton administration, a Democratic administration, worked with a Republican Congress to create a framework for global electronic commerce and for the internet that was very much conducive to a growth and innovation. And it was a wonderful time. People took it for granted then, they didn't realize what was happening, but it really laid the groundwork for what became the digital revolution and helped America become a global powerhouse. And that was a powerful story. It was a real world natural experiment, what was happening here versus in Europe at the time that walked down a very different path with a heavy-handed precautionary hand and really suffocated a lot of their innovators. Again, a lot of them flocking to come to America to get the freedom, the sweet waters of freedom and innovate and succeed. So policy-wise, it comes down to bipartisan agreement, openness to change and creative destruction and all that. Culturally, it's a harder thing. It requires an attitudinal change on behalf of the public that is going to be very, very hard, and it's not something that can be controlled from above or steered. It happens much more organically. And the slide that I presented with all of those movies and television shows and plots and everything, I should have mentioned some of those movies that I had on there are my favorite movies of all time. My favorite movie of all time is 2001: A Space Odyssey. And I love sci-fi plots that involve, crazy robots and AI gone wrong. I mean, people love those kind of titillating stories, right? But the problem is that our brains have been just marinated in so much dystopian dread by popular culture and thinking around AI robotics that it's going to be hard to know how to break out of that. In fact, I wrote a piece a couple years ago where I challenged my readers to name for me positive depictions of robotics or AI in books, movies, or television. And there were a few, but not many. And it was really it was troubling to me because it was just like it was saying we can't even find anything in our culture that like tells us positive stories about the future. And I think that needs to change. You may know the famous sci-fi novelist Neil Stephenson. Many years ago, he was concerned enough about this that he worked with Arizona State University to create a project called Project Hieroglyph, where they actually went out and spent some money to encourage young sci-fi writers to write positive stories about the future and change, technological change. Unsurprisingly, it wasn't a bestseller. Positive stories about the future are just kind of like, oh, it worked. It was great. We prospered. It's like that's not as titillating as like robots are going to come and kill us and eat us. That's going to sell. That's going to be something that puts, bodies in seats to watch a movie for 2.5 hours. That cultural narrative is again very, very difficult to change. I think it begins, however, with a step back from apocalyptic thinking and rhetoric and the sort of threat inflation we see that like AI is like, an atomic bomb or, whatever. And no, it's not. It's not anything like that. And these sort of things are being driven by people who benefit from being fear entrepreneurs, as I call them. I want people to be real world entrepreneurs. I want them to be makers, not takers. I want them to reconceptualize a future that benefits humanity and not one that curses it. But it's going to require some positive change at many different layers, both culturally and politically.
Yeah, I mean it's sobering, but I certainly think it's possible, and I think that the message has come across that a new world is certainly possible with regards to the policies that we relate to innovation. Adam, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you on behalf of the Hayek program here at the LSE. It's been a pleasure to have you, and I hope that perhaps we can have you sometime in the future as well.
I'd
To
love
our,
that. Thank you so much.
yeah, thank you. And to our audience, thank you all for joining us. Do check out other events, check out our YouTube channel, and follow us on the LSE website for further announcements and events coming forward. Thank you so much.